Hello and welcome to this session in which we will discuss tort liability. And we're going to be discussing tort liability in the context of agency law. Simply put, is the principal responsible for the tort liability of the agent? Well, first we need to know what's tort liability to have a good idea before we can discuss this. So let's define briefly what tort liability is. It's a legal responsibilities that happens that occurred when one party commits a tort, a civil wrong, causing harm or loss to another. Now, tort liabilities have two main categories, negligence and intentional torts. Let's see what negligence is versus intentional torts. Negligence happens when someone fails to take reasonable care, leading to unintentional, not intentional harm to another. So the key element here include due care, breach of that duty. So you did not do this on purpose. You did not try to get into an accident. It happened. Maybe you were not careful. Maybe you were careful and nevertheless you got into an accident. But you did not mean to do that. So a car accident will be an example of negligence caused by a driver texting. That will be considered a negligence, an example of it. Intentional torts, those involve deliberate, on-purpose action. You're doing this intentionally to cause harm to another person. It's not about the harm intended, it's the act itself being intentional. For example, assaulting someone, battery, and defamation. Those are actual intentional torts. Defamation when you say something wrong about that individual, trying to ruin their reputation. Battery and assault, trying to attack someone physically. An example will be threatening to hit someone, even if no physical contact is made. That's an intentional tort. So you have to understand you have more legal repercussion under intentional tort because you were doing this on purpose. The other party can make you pay what's called punitive damages. However, under negligence, usually compensatory damages. So now we know what tort liability. Now we need to take this information and try to explain it within the context of agency law. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we proceed any further, I have a public announcement about my company, FarhatLectures.com. Farhat Accounting Lectures is a supplemental educational tool that's going to help you with your CPA exam preparation as well as your accounting courses. My CPA material is aligned with your CPA review course such as Becker, Roger, Wiley, Gleam, Miles. My accounting courses are aligned with your accounting courses, broken down by chapter and topics. My resources consist of lectures, multiple choice questions, true-false questions, as well as exercises. Go ahead, start your free trial today. What is the general rule for agent liability? Is the principal responsible for agent liability, an agent tort? Well, typically, an agent could be either an employee or a contractor, is responsible for their own wrongful act or tort. Typically means generally. Guess what? If it's generally, it means there's exception. A principal, like an employer or a company, usually not held liable for these acts, generally speaking, unless they fall under Respondeat superior. This is a Latin, it's a legal doctrine that establishes certain circumstances under which an employer can be held responsible for the action of their employees. Now, Respondeat superior means the term means answering to the master. It means you have an employee that's answering to someone. Under this doctrine, an employer can be held liable for the tort or wrongful act committed by an employee, notice, not at any time, if these acts are done within the scope of their employment. So when is the employer responsible? Is when you are committing those torts and it's in the act of completing your work. It's related to your work. This means what? The actions must be closely related to the duties the employee is supposed to perform and occur during the period of employment. So it's part of your job, you're doing your job, and that tort happened. Now bear in mind, there's a dual liability here. Even an employer can be held responsible under this doctrine. It doesn't mean that the employee is off the hook, because the person that's harmed, they can sue you, the agent, and they can sue your employer. Both the employer and the employee can be sued and held liable for the employee's action. Let's take a look at an example. Speedy Deliveries, one of their drivers, while making deliveries, negligently runs a red light and causes an accident, injured another driver. Here's how the respondent superior applies. Well, employee liability. The driver is liable. The driver personally is liable for the accident because they were negligent. They failed to drive carefully and obey the traffic laws. The employer, as the employer, also can be held liable because the driver was performing their job duties, delivering packages when the accident occurred. So the company can be considered responsible for the driver's action during their work. Again, the injured party can sue both the driver and the company. Now, we have to understand the difference between employee versus contractor. Employee, hopefully you know what an employee is when you work for a company, but sometimes that's not a clear cut. So we have to understand the rules between employee and contractor. What differentiates the two? It's the degree of control that the employer requires between the two. The distinction between an employee and an independent contractor hinges primarily on the degree of control. And this is an important topic in taxation because when it comes to taxation, there's a lot of consequences to payroll tax, whether you're treating someone as an employee or as a contractor. So whatever you learn here is also relevant for REG because under the regulation exam, the tax exam, you have to know this. So the distinction is crucial because it determines the employer's liability for the worker's action. So how do we know whether the person is an employee or that person is a contractor? Well, the right of control. How much does the employer control the employee? Well, an employer has significant control over how an employee performs their work. Think about it. When you work for a company, they tell you to show up at a certain amount, at a certain time, 8 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock. Specifying the methods, how you do your work, providing detailed instruction, and you have to follow those instructions, providing the computer, the office space for you. That's an employee. Independent contractor typically has more autonomy in how they complete their work. You complete the work the way you see fit as long as you get your work done. The employer control is more about the outcome of the work rather than the process of getting there. So the employer wants the work done in a certain way, but the contractor does the work. So the contractor is completing the work themselves according to their standards. There are additional factors in determining whether this is a person is an employee or a contractor. The nature of the worker's business. Does the worker operate their own business? If they operate their own business, they're contractor. Or are they integrated with the employer's business, or are they part of that business? Tools and facilities. Who provides the necessary tools and facilities? Do they bring their own tools? Do they have their own office at their house or an office somewhere else? Or do they use the tools for the company and they have an office there? If they do that, most likely they're an employee. Length and type of employment. Is the engagement short-term? Usually if it's for a short-term, for a specific project, it's a contractor. Or is it an ongoing and indefinite? Then this is an employee. How are you paying this employee? Are you paying them by the hour or per project? If you're paying them per project, most likely they're a contractor. And here's what makes a difference for the IRS. Are you paying them with a W-2 or are you paying them with a 1099? 1099 are contractor, W-2s are employees, and that makes a huge difference on payroll taxes. Do you supervise them? Do you closely supervise them, or you let them do their work and they give you the end product? If you closely supervise them, they're an employee. Now bear in mind, again, if the company is audited, they would look at everything. They don't look at one thing, they would look at everything to determine whether the person is an employee or a contractor. Now when a tort occurs, the person suing the company, suing this person that committed the tort, they might say, well, I want to sue your employer. And the employer would say, look, this is not my employee, this is a contractor. I hired them to do the work. They're not my employee. This is where this becomes relevant. Let's look at an example to illustrate the concept. Consider a graphic designer who works full-time at a marketing firm. The designer uses the firm's computers, software, works regular hours set by the firm, receives salary, and closely supervised. What do you think this individual is? This individual is an employee. Here, the firm controls not only what work is done, but also how it's done, where it's done, and it's being supervised. Now, think about a CPA. A CPA, Certified Public Accountant, that's the future you, is hired by a company to conduct an audit. Well, the CPA uses their own computers, software, work from her or his own office, and is paid a flat fee for the audit and decides his or her own approach for conducting the audit without supervision. Well, guess what? When you hire a CPA to conduct an audit, that's a contractor. This arrangement suggests an independent contractor relationship as the company is concerned with the final audit report, but not how the CPA conduct the audit. This concept is important in determining an employer liability. So we don't look also at the employee-employer relationship, it's also the scope of employment. Because if there's an injury, what's the scope of employment of that employee? An employer is only liable for an employee's action that lead to an injury if these actions occur during the scope of the employee's job. It's the employee doing their work and the injury happened. This means the injury must happen while the employee is engaged in work activities, both in terms of time and location. Now, we have to look at the nature of the activities. Well, the specific conduct causing the injury does not need to be directly authorized by the employer. So, no employer is going to tell their employee to commit a tort. What matters is the conduct falls within the general type and work of the employee was hired to do. But if that tort happened during that time, it doesn't mean, and the employer, they never told them to commit a tort, but if it happened during that time, then the employer is responsible. Why? Because when they're doing their work, what are they doing? The court says it's their intent to serve their employer. So the employee's action must be motivated, at least in part, by a desire to further the employer's interest. Because when they're doing their work and they are doing the work for the employer and they committed a tort, then they are working for the employer as if the employer committed that tort themselves, even if the method of doing so is inappropriate or unauthorized. Let's take a look for an example. Let's assume a bouncer working at a bar. What's the job of the bouncer? Is making sure no one is aggressive, if there's a fight, to break up the fight, so on and so forth. So the bouncer's primary role is to maintain safe and orderly environment. Suppose the bouncer aggressively confront and physically harm a disruptive customer. Well, think about it. Do you think the employer wants them to harm physically that customer? No, but they want them to maintain a safe and orderly environment, but that's part of the job. Although the bar owner did not instruct the bouncer to harm the customer, the bouncer's action could be seen as extension of their job responsibilities, which is maintaining order. The aggressive behavior occurred in the course of the bouncer duties was motivated by the job requirement. You're doing so to do what? To create a safe and nice environment at that bar. So this aggressive customer don't bother other customers. So in this scenario, the bar owner could be held liable for the bouncer's action. The reason because the bouncer's conduct, though unauthorized, most likely they never told them to use excessive force, falls within the general scope of the job, ensuring bar safety, and that was done with the intent to fulfill their job responsibilities, managing disruptive customers. Therefore, the employer is responsible. We also have to differentiate between negligence, intentional torts, or crime. In the context of employer liability for employees' action, the distinction between negligence, intentional torts, and crime is important. So what is the employer liability for negligence? Typically, employers are held liable for negligent act committed by their employees if they did this within the scope of their employment. Negligence involves carelessness rather than deliberate wrongdoing. Now, there's an exception for intentional tort, which are deliberate acts intended to cause harm, are generally not considered within the scope of employment. Think about it. Do you think if you work at a place and they ask you to intentionally harm someone, you should not be working there? That's not a place of employment. That's the work of a gangster, right? Therefore, employers are usually not liable for these actions. However, there are exceptions. Let's assume your employer asks you to do so. If the employer explicitly or even implicitly authorized the harmful act, they may be held liable. You should not be working there in the first place, right? Or the use of force in a job role. For example, as we just looked earlier at the bouncer or a security guard, well, under those circumstances, a security guard might harm someone on purpose to protect themselves and protect the place of business. That's an intentional tort. Nevertheless, it's the employer will be held liable here because that's part of the work. How about crimes? For serious criminal act, like carrying an illegal weapon, an employer is generally not held liable unless carrying weapon is part of your job. For example, if you transport money from one location to the other, you might be armed. That's a different story. But if you're carrying arm and you're delivering pizza, well, that's not part of your job. Okay? Such actions are typically outside the scope of any employment and are considered for the sole responsibility of the employees. So if you commit a crime, your employer cannot be held liable for that. Consider an employee who illegally carries a concealed weapon at work and uses it to commit a crime. Yes, it's during the work hours, but the employer never allowed it. It's not part of their job description. The employer cannot be held responsible. Since carrying and using a legal weapon is a serious crime and not related to the employee's job duties, the employer would generally not be held liable for this criminal act. Now let's discuss independent contractor. Employer liability for independent contractor differ from those of employees. Remember, employees, you have this Respondeat superior. It means they respond to you. You're the master of the employee. Well, contractors are different. An employer or a principal is not held liable for the tort committed by an independent contractor. This is because the independent contractor operate their own business and are not under the direct control of the employer in how they perform their work. There are exceptions, of course, but those exceptions are few. Well, if the employer explicitly or implicitly authorizes a wrongful act, well, of course, if you tell the contractor to do something illegal, you'll be held responsible for that. That's obvious. And as a contractor, you should not be doing this because that's illegal. Or if the activity involve ultra-hazardous activities, and this is an exception. Employer may also be held liable for torts committed during what we call ultra-hazardous or inherently dangerous activities, even if performed by independent contractor. And here they want to make sure that the independent contractor, as well as the person that hires them, to hold them at a higher level. Why? For the public good. These are activities that carry inherent risk regardless of the precaution taken. Therefore, putting the principal and the contractor liability on the line will make them more careful. Let's take a look at an example. A construction company, an employer, that hires an independent contractor to demolish a building. So notice they hired them. This demolisher, it's an independent contractor. Well, demolishing is considered an inherently dangerous activity because of the high risk involved regardless of the precaution taking. So during the demolition, the contractor negligently handles explosive resulting in the damage of a nearby property. Well, although this is the act of the contractor, typically the construction company will not be held liable for torts that are committed by an independent contractor, but in this case, they will be. So this is the exception. Since the demolition is inherently dangerous, the construction company can be held liable for the damage caused by the contractor's negligence. Why? Again, why do they want you to do this? To hold the contractor as well as the company to a higher standard, because here you are harming the public, so you have to be extra careful. We also have to know that liability cannot be limited by agreement between the employer and the employee. So an employer cannot evade liability for an employee's tort by making an agreement with the employee. What does that mean? It means if they told them, don't do this particular activity, and it's in a contract, and when this individual, let's assume they drive carelessly, and they told them, don't drive carelessly. Well, the employer still can say, well, we told them not to do it, but they did it. Well, we're not responsible. No, if the employee causes harm within the scope of their employment, third party can still hold the employer liable. Simply put, you cannot disconnect yourself from the employee. However, the employer might go after the employee for reimbursement because they told them not to do it, but they can be sued by third parties. Let's take a look at the multiple choice questions from farhatlectures.com. Under what circumstances might an employer be held liable for the intentional torts of an employee? Notice here it's intentional. Intentional means they should not be held liable because it's intentional. If an employee acted out of personal motive unrelated to work, of course they will not be held responsible, so that's out. If the employee committed something unrelated to work for personal motive, that's not the employer's business. They might be fired, but that's about it. If the employee was acting within the scope of their employment, well, if they're acting in the scope of their employment, it is possible. Under what circumstances? Remember, if the nature of your work, remember if you're a bouncer, security guard, you might intentionally hurt someone. That's not what you wanted to do, but it's an intentional tort. You could be a little bit aggressive as a bouncer or as a security guard. This could happen. So B is a good answer, but let's look for C and D. If the employee was off duty at the time of the tort, forget it. If they're off duty, it has nothing to do with their employer. They're not working. If the employee was working remotely, no, that doesn't mean, the employer will be held responsible. That's also not a good answer. So the best answer is B. If the employee was acting within the scope of their employment, they could get their employer involved in their intentional torts if that intentional torts happened within the scope of their employment. Again, a bouncer and a security guard will be good examples, and any examples that you can think of. What should you do now? You want to go to Farhat lectures, look at additional MCQs. That's going to help you, whether you're studying for your CPA exam or taking business law. Invest in yourself. Study hard. The CPA exam is worth it. Good luck, and of course, stay safe.